Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar where we will be talking about planning and executing migrations to the cloud. I am Marcy. I am part of Inova Solutions' marketing team, and I'm very proud to welcome Mr. Nestor Diaz, who I think is amazing at what he does. And he is the lead of the Azure Task Force here at Inova Solutions. Um, Please help me welcome Nestor Diaz, and he will start his presentation.
Oh, thank you, Marcy. I'll try to live up to that hype. Um, Welcome everyone to our first or one of our first Tech Talk sessions. Today we'll be covering what we need to keep in mind when we're planning and actually executing our migrations to the cloud. So let's maybe start by taking a brief look at our agenda for our session today. Um, First off, we'll start by briefly covering a little bit about Inova Solutions, who we are, what we do, and then we'll really get into the meat and potatoes of our session. We'll start by talking about what we need to keep in mind before we execute a migration, what we need to keep in mind in terms of whether our workload is right to migrate, how we actually migrate it, what we migrate it to. And then we'll look at some tools that are available to help simplify the execution of that migration. And finally, we'll close out by seeing how Inova Solutions can actually complement the tools that are available and help your business make the most out of them. So let's get right into it. Most of you may know Inova Solutions as a Microsoft solution provider, or rather a Microsoft licensing provider for the Caribbean and South America. In fact, we are the best Microsoft licensing solution provider in the Caribbean and South America. But we are more than that. We are really committed to helping your business adopt digital transformation. It's in fact part of our mission, which is to empower organizations of all sizes to create business advantages by adopting digital transformation. We do that by helping you build a sustainable path to digital, one where we minimize friction and maximize the adoption of the new tools that your business starts to integrate into your day-to-day so that you can better serve your customers and employees. And we do this through our offerings, which we can essentially categorize in three groups. We, of course, provide Microsoft licensing, and we have very, very capable people that do that. Microsoft licensing can be quite complex. Should you use per user or per device licensing in your particular case? Should you use server cal or per core licensing? Can you apply the stacking metric to that very particular Windows Server use case? Well, our licensing specialists can answer all of those questions and more and ensure that you don't overpay for your licensing, but that you do remain compliant. We can also provide user training, and this could be custom end user training to allow your users to understand and maximize the benefits that they get from the tools that you acquire. But it can also include IT user training, certified curriculums provided by Microsoft, taught by our instructors that allow your IT users to ensure that they can administer and manage securely and safely the tools that your business acquires. And of course, the area where perhaps there has been the most growth as of late is our IT solutions department. We have a team of dedicated experts that can provide consulting, guidance, and support for your IT team, whether it's a one-off issue that you're facing, whether it's a project that you want to undertake, or whether it's a recurring service to continually help your business make the most out of its investments. Now, let's talk about planning and executing migrations to the cloud. And it's important as we do so to really understand why we want to move to the cloud. It's really important that we understand what the motivation is for our migration before we even talk about how we're going to actually execute it. Uh, at Inova Solutions, I lead a group called the Inova Solutions Azure Task Force. And very core or very close to the core of what this group does, which is helping businesses make the most out of cloud technologies, are the three tenets that you're seeing on screen. And they're very relevant to this discussion of understanding why we're moving to the cloud. And the three tenets are as follows. Number one, that doing cloud for the sake of doing cloud, just saying, hey, look at me, look how modern I am. Let's be honest, is useless. Number two, the doing cloud for some promised but never demonstrated mythical cost reduction is also useless. Because number three, if we do cloud without a strategy to specifically pinpoint what costs I'm reducing and how I'm measuring them, and what added business value I'm bringing to my organization, if that solid foundation is not in place, then all of my effort could very well be useless. And there's a reason these beliefs are at our core. And it's because we found that when this solid foundation is not in place, it leads to projects and adoption of the cloud that goes, as you see on screen, as this iceberg shows, where we say, oh yes, I see the iceberg. I have that data center and I'm going to decommission it. I'm going to phase it out. That data center has 100 VMs. So when I migrate 80 of those VMs to the cloud, I'll still have some legwork to do, but for the most part, I can consider my project a success. But without that solid foundation, I may miss the majority of that iceberg. I may miss the fact that managing those VMs on premise is not the same as managing them in the cloud. And those very routine maintenance tasks that took my IT staff 5 to 15 minutes now take 45 minutes to an hour. And that puts me way behind my IT schedule because I'm having to learn as I do. I may miss that 9 out of the 10 apps that exist in that data center migrated wonderfully, but the 10th one was very transactional and was very, very dependent on low latency. So when it was running on my on-premise data center where I had 3 milliseconds of latency, it was running gorgeously. But as soon as I sent it off to the cloud and now there's 90 milliseconds of latency, it is unusable. I may miss the fact that one of the apps that lives within my data center has data that has to stay in European data centers rather than US data centers. And if I don't have that solid foundation in place, I may soon come to find out that the iceberg that I thought I had managed is a lot larger and more unmanageable than I thought. And if I find out too late, I may very well find out by the moment I'm crashing into it. So we don't want that. We want to ensure that we can start our cloud migration journey with this solid foundation in place. So how do we do that? Well, within the IT world, we've come to adopt a very, very solid and very good theory called fail fast. Fail fast states that if I want to find the best way to do something, I can try a lot of things and I can eliminate the ones that don't work. What we want to do with our cloud migration strategy, though, is we want to one-up fail fast, and we want to adopt a fail less mindset. And we'll come into why this mindset is so useful as we move further into our presentation. But essentially, consider the fact that your cloud migration is not just an IT concern. We're talking, if we're going to do cloud right, about digital transformation. And this is something that touches on everybody in your organization. It's a lot of people, and people resist change. So the less change we introduce, the less things we have them testing and trying out to then eliminate, the better adopted it will be. So we want to do that by adopting this fail less mindset. And how does that actually work? How can I eliminate candidates for a migration if I don't actually try them? Well, those blue letters there have the key. And it is the fact that despite this being an IT concern, despite migrating to the cloud and adopting cloud being an IT concern, we don't want to frame it in tech terms. We want to frame it in business terms. We want to talk about why the business wants to move to the cloud. What's the motivation behind it? We want to talk about what success along the lines of that motivation looks like. If my motivation is to provide better customer service, how do I measure that? And what metric lets me know that I've achieved success in that business outcome? And once those two are in place, we want to verify that there is a business case, a business justification for this migration. Does the ROI, is the additional value that I'm creating actually worth the effort that I'm going to put in to migrate to the cloud? And it is these three areas that will allow me to then decide what paths to migration are actually sustainable for my business and are actually right for my business. Now, before we get into actually determining these things, though, it's always important for us to have a clear understanding of what the cloud is and what it isn't, what it does and what it does not do. And to do that, we want to go into a little bit of cloud myth busting. So let's start with that first myth there, that the cloud is always more expensive. Honestly, If we compare one-to-one what we would have to deploy on premise to mirror what the cloud offers, to mirror having triple redundancy in power supplies for each of my servers, to mirror having triple redundancy for each of my VM instances, to mirror having geographic redundancy across several different data centers, to mirror having the aggressive refresh cycles that cloud data centers have, it's really not possible for most of our organizations to achieve the cost savings and the hyperscale that public cloud providers can achieve. And so when comparing one-to-one, the fact of the matter is that the cloud is usually going to be cheaper. However, this leads us to myth number 2, that the cloud is always cheaper. And if we're going to be very honest, that's not necessarily true either. While this assumption that comparing one-to-one the cloud is going to be cheaper is usually true, there may be some particular cases where cloud operating costs could be higher. This could be, for instance, a company that works in the manufacturing or engineering space, and maybe because of the very particular and specialized hardware this company uses, they have very long refresh cycles, 10, 12-year hardware refresh cycles. Maybe that type of company, for most of their workloads, it may be more expensive to move them to the cloud. However, it's important to understand that just because everything is not necessarily cheaper does not mean or does not make the cloud not worth it. That is to say, server costs and hardware costs are not always the driver for my business case. That tends to be the myth, that lower cost is always going to be the driver for my migration to the cloud. But that's not necessarily true. A much more solid business case can be built when we take into account realizing new business value or capturing missed business value. Let's be honest, our world is becoming increasingly more digital. Our world is becoming increasingly more and more dependent on technology. And across all industries, we're seeing higher and higher levels of use of technology to maximize the quality of the service that we provide our customers and our employees. And if there is a growing dependency on technology and an increasing use of technology, then it follows that my investment in technology has to go up. I cannot get more for less all the time. However, if that investment in technology comes along with a realizing of additional value, if I have to pay more for having my web app be triply redundant to achieve 5 nines of availability, but that extra cost means that I sell more through my web app or that I convert more customers through my web app, then it's a worthwhile investment. So costs aren't everything as we move to the cloud, and it's something that's important to keep in mind. Another myth that we should look at is the idea that everything should work or should move into the cloud. And honestly, I don't see this being true anytime soon, maybe in some distant future. But for most of our organizations, especially us in the Caribbean, we know the reality. Power can go down, the internet can go down, and we may have some business critical workloads where we can't afford to not have access to X or Y server simply because I don't have an internet connection, where being down for 5 or 10 minutes can be completely intolerable for my business. And for some of these workloads, we usually will benefit from a hybrid approach. There are other workloads such as identity, hooking up my on-prem Active Directory to Azure Active Directory that can add capabilities to my existing on-prem workloads. And I can then manage mobile devices or devices that aren't necessarily added to my local AD. There are workloads that may be completely incompatible with the cloud. We mentioned the manufacturing and engineering spaces before, and maybe there's a very particular, very specific, very expensive piece of equipment that depends on very, very legacy hardware that I cannot have in the cloud. So let's be honest, not everything is going to move into the cloud, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be other pieces of my business that will not benefit from cloud migration. And finally, this is another common one. Since we're talking Microsoft, since we're talking Azure, you can't do open source software on Azure. Well, that's also not true. In fact, more than half of the VMs on Azure are Linux VM, around 68% of them. most of the scripting and coding technologies on Azure, support technologies such as Java, PHP, Python, and other open source languages. And in fact, many open source services from infrastructure to databases to applications run very well and are run very commonly on Azure. All right, so we've dispelled some myths. Let's get into understanding why we want to move to the cloud. Now that we know what the cloud is and what it isn't, let's get into what could be motivations for my business to adopt the cloud. And there's some potential motivations on screen right now. It could be critical business events, like maybe an acquisition or a merger. It could be the need to reduce capital expenses. So maybe I have a development team that needs to stress test their applications, and management doesn't want to invest in a very large server that will be used for stress testing for a couple of months and will then remain unused for most of the time until there's an extra need for stress testing. Maybe there's a data sovereignty requirement that needs a particular piece or group of information within my organization to exist in European data centers, but my business is located in Puerto Rico. Maybe I want an increase in business agility. I want to be able to scale to meet seasonal demands. And there are many different kinds of motivations. However, it's important that we do the exercise of identifying which motivations apply to my business and actually writing them out, whether that's physically or in some sort of digital note-taking or document. It's important that we set these motivations in paper because this whole process will run as a sort of domino effect. It's the motivations that will help me identify my outcomes, that will help me build my business case, that will then help me understand as I'm performing my migration if I'm being successful or not. This is what will eliminate the guessing game and what will sort of open my doors to that fail less mindset. So let's say we have a development team, and our development team wants to increase their agility. They want to be able to stress test their applications when needed, spin up VMs, spin them down, not have to pay for large servers that will remain unused most of the time. And they also want to be able to scale to meet demand. So if there's seasonal demand of our internal applications, we want to have our development team be able to write out configurations for our servers that automatically scale up or down and respond to demand. So that's our motivation. We want to scale to meet demand. We want to increase our business agility. Now, what does success look like in those environments? What is the business outcome? Well, we want to scale to meet demand in order to, let's say, maximize customer satisfaction and in order to increase profits. So what's a KPI that we can actually measure there? Let's not just leave it up to a guessing game. Well, I'll need to achieve 85% of customer satisfaction in all transactions. And how do I measure that? Well, I'll offer them a discount if they complete a survey. I also need to ensure that the application is highly available. So I need to achieve, I don't know, 3 nines of availability, and I'll measure that using a monthly average. And I want to ensure that my profits year over year grow 3%. And so we're using our motivations to identify expected business outcomes and set clear metrics related to these outcomes. More often than not, we make the mistake of saying, well, I want to do this to increase customer satisfaction, and we leave it there. But if we don't set a measurable metric and target for us to hit, how can we know if our project was successful or if it fell into the iceberg pitfall of being essentially just a wasted effort? So we want to be able to set these clear, measurable, expected business outcomes. This will then allow us to build our business justification. That is to say, this is what I want to achieve. This is what I'm currently spending. This is the effort that is going to take me to get to where I want to be. Is there actual ROI here? This is the additional business value I'm creating. Is there actual return on investment? And this is potentially the most tedious of these stages, but it's also very important. It's tedious because it may require us to work with our, say, financial or accounting teams to determine if my data center has a completely separate building. Well, I know the cost of the servers in there. I may know the cost of the salary for my IT employees, but do I know the cost of the power, the cooling, the rent? If the data center is within a larger building. Well, I'll need to know the square footage of the building to then divide the rent by the percentage of square footage that my data center occupies, so I know what percentage of that rent is actually a cost of my data center. And so it can be, to be completely sincere, a sort of tedious process. But it's important because, again, we want to adopt that fail less mindset. And we want to ensure that our workload is right for migration. And if we're not reducing costs enough, if we're not creating enough business value, this process will show it. And it will show us how long it'll take us to get ROI, or if there even is going to be a projected ROI before we put the effort in. We want to be sure that we put the work in at the beginning so we don't necessarily waste a lot of money and effort down the line. So we have our motivations, we have our expected outcomes, we have our business justifications. What's next? Well, what's next is actually starting to plan our migration. How do I take these motivations and these expected business outcomes, this business conversation, and now turn it into a technology conversation? Well, it all starts by understanding your digital estate. I'm going to take a brief break here to take a sip of water. And I should say, at any point, if you have any questions, concerns, doubts, feel free to type them in that Q&A box that you should see on your screens. There will be a space at the end of the session where we'll get to those questions. So what is your digital estate? It's nothing more than the collection of IT assets that powers your business. That could be physical servers, that could be VMs, that could be data, that could be applications. It's essentially the different workloads that power your business. So it's important that you assess your digital estate and you have a clear and accurate inventory of your digital estate. What applications are you running? Which of those are in-house developed applications? What tech stack do they run on? How many servers do you have? What are the specs for those servers? How much of their capacity is actually being utilized? The same metrics for your VMs. What OSs are they running? Are those OSs under support or are they at end of support? Etc. etc. Understanding this digital estate is key because now we need to talk about, based on those motivations, based on what I want to do, what approach am I going to take to migrating? And there's two big categories essentially of approaches. A migrate approach, which is mostly focused on moving things to the cloud quickly with as few changes as possible. I just need to get that out of on-prem and into the cloud. Or we could look at an innovate approach. An innovate approach focuses more on getting the most out of the cloud by transforming my assets or perhaps even completely replacing them with a digital first solution. And what do we mean by a digital first solution? Well, very often, despite the fact that we adopt the cloud and that we transform our businesses using technology, we still do it in our old mindsets. We still do it in the very pen and paper analog mindset. A quick example may be requisitions. If you're all in IT, you may know very well when you need to procure new equipment, you probably fill out a requisition form. And maybe 10 to 15 years ago, that was a paper form that you filled out and you put in someone's tray in accounting and they would look at it and approve it or deny it and send it back to you. So you would then continue the approvals process. And so at some point, someone probably said, no, we need to digitalize this approvals process. So now we're no longer using pen and paper. We are using PDFs, which is just a digital one-to-one analogy of a paper. It's not necessarily the most efficient way to digitalize things. We are storing these large 7 to 10 megabyte files for a simple approval and some information that could be stored in a couple kilobytes instead. And so that migrate approach, getting it to digital as soon as possible, is replacing the pen and paper requisitions form with a PDF. Meanwhile, an innovate approach would be deploying an app to handle approvals integrated with Utilize, where you can go to your distributors and see accurate, up-to-date pricing. And then you can use M365 to automatically fill out a form with your Utilize quote and send that over to your managers, and they can digitally within M365 approve or deny, and it continues this sort of approval workflow completely digitally. So it takes more effort up front, but you're realizing more of that digitalization value. Now, how do we determine which of these two approaches I want to apply? Well, the process of evaluating your assets to determine the best way to migrate to the cloud is called rationalization. And that's what we're going to look at next. But before we do so, we'll do a second and final session of myth busting. Because it's easy to think that by mirroring your on-premise environment, so by adopting more of a migrate approach, that's going to be the best way for me to just get on the cloud and start saving money. But that's not necessarily true. What we find most of the time, in fact, more than 50% of the time, is that it's our hardware is usually that's where I was looking for. Sorry, our hardware is usually very unused. And it makes sense. When we're buying hardware on premises, we're making an investment that we want to last for several years. So we don't buy for the capacity that we have now. We buy thinking of the capacity I'll have in a year, in 2 years. And so it's very common that we'll have very large servers and we're not using those servers to anything close to like 70 or 80% of their capacity. It's probably closer to 20 or 30% of their capacity. So if we move those servers as is to the cloud, we'll also be paying for capacity that we're not using. Now, on-prem, that makes sense because buying an additional server is a complex and time-consuming process. But in the cloud, I can resize a VM in a couple of minutes. So why would I pay for unused capacity? Now, that leads us then to maybe thinking of the other extreme. And there's where myth number 2 comes into play. Well, if migrate is not the best way to realize value, then we'll just innovate with everything. We'll transform all of my stack, all of my tech stack and my workloads to get maximum cloud value. And then we'll simply toss them to the cloud because let's be honest, this cloud thing is easy and fast. It'll be like flipping a light switch and we're done. But honestly, doing cloud right, as we mentioned, is related to digital transformation. And it's related to an intense technical change. It's not necessarily going to happen overnight. In fact, our spend, even if we're looking to reduce it, is not going to go down overnight. Gartner did a study where they looked at a very large data center and they looked at decommissioning that data center and sending it completely to the cloud and how costs change during that process. The dark bars are on-premises cost, the gray bars are one-time migration investments, and the blue bars, light blue bars, are cloud costs. And notice how early on in the migration process, as I start to maybe run tests or proof of concepts or train my staff, my on-prem data center costs aren't going down because I can't simply turn off my data center. While this runs, while I test that it's stable, I have to keep my on-premise data center. And so for a while, and this isn't something that happens overnight either, for a while, I may have both on-premise, cloud, and migration costs. As I train my staff, as I test that applications are compatible, as I get end users used to the new way to access their apps and services. Eventually though, notice how on-prem costs go down, migration costs disappear, and even cloud costs as I continue to optimize and transform my business are significantly reduced. So it's not necessarily a process that will run as easy as flipping a light switch, but it is very much a process that can, number one, help you reduce costs, and number two, and more importantly, help you add additional business value and efficiency. So it's important to keep that in mind. This is going to be a process. It's not going to be a 1 or 2 day or 1 or 2 month thing, but it is a process that is very much worth it. So once we have those myths out of the way, once we understand that maybe I don't want to exactly mirror my on-prem environment, but I do have to realize that the innovate approach does take more of an initial investment, an initial effort, I can look at what Microsoft calls the 5 R's of rationalization. As we look at this slide, I'll add some ink here, and I do apologize because I'm writing with my mouse, so I'm not sure how clear this will be, but we'll try. These 5 R's of rationalization, as we move to the right, we're looking at closer to an innovate approach. And as we move to the left, we're looking closer to a migration approach. At the same time, as we move to the right, we're looking at more initial effort. Oh, wow, that O is terrible. And as we move to the left, we're going to be looking at less initial effort most of the time. And we'll see what we mean by that. So the first way we can rationalize our assets, the first way we can plan to migrate is simply to rehost. And you may know rehost as lift and shift. It's just moving a current asset to the cloud as is with minimal changes. If we need to get something in the cloud quickly due to maybe a regulatory need, due to a need to free up data center space, a need to achieve higher redundancy, we want to have a failover of a local server on the cloud, then maybe a lift and shift approach would be right for us. It's important to understand that a rehost, however, usually implies infrastructure as a service purchase. And those, number one, can be expensive, but number two, still carry with them the overhead of having to actually manage those servers in the cloud. So we could potentially move to a refactor effort. And a refactor effort focuses on slightly tweaking or reconfiguring an application, say an application that uses a local SQL Server VM, and maybe we reconfigure that application to run on an app service, and the SQL Server instance we deploy on Azure SQL. And so it usually focuses on these tweaks that allow us to then fit our workloads onto a platform as a service model. This means less overhead for our IT staff to manage. It means faster and shorter updates, and it usually means greater cloud efficiency, a lot greater use to set up things like much more ease of use, I should say, to set up things like autoscale and similar technologies that will really allow me to get the most out of that cloud agility. Past refactoring, you can look at re-architecting. And this could be applications where we do have to put some more legwork in. Perhaps we have an application that is meant to run on an actual physical server as a scheduled task, and I re-architect it. I rewrite some of those methods and functions to maybe run it on a serverless platform as an Azure function in the cloud. And then instead of paying for a VM that's running 24/7, I only pay for the time that my functions are running. We could go past that and actually rebuild an application. We may have applications that aren't compatible with the cloud at all. Maybe they were very, very legacy applications, and we have to start over with a completely new code base. Of course, there's going to have to be a very solid business case in order for us to do that. But sometimes it's an approach that is absolutely worth it. Maybe I have an aging website where it worked mostly as a static a business card. But now I'm a government agency, and I want to allow citizens to actually access some of my services through my website portal. And so I'm going to completely replace my website with a brand new solution that includes things like account management, that includes things like a backend with services that I can offer to my citizens, right? So that could be an application that would fit in that rebuild approach. And finally, sometimes there are boxed software as a service applications that may provide all the flexibility and functionality that I require. Is it really worth it to take that Zimbra server up to the cloud? Or should I just start using Office 365 and use Exchange Online? And so this is why I said that most of the time, the more we innovate, it requires more effort, because frankly, this replace stage might sometimes be a lot less work than actually re-architecting, rebuilding, or refactoring an application. And so we have to really take a look at what our assets are, how I use them, and what my goals as a business are to be able to choose which of these approaches I'm going to pursue. And once I've chosen a rationalization approach, well, I've mostly have my planning considerations in place. I may have to take a look at some additional training considerations on perhaps preparing source and destination environments, but for the most part, my planning is done. So what's available now to help me actually execute on this plan? What tools are available to support that effort? Well, let's assume you've chosen a rehost approach. I'd like to introduce you to Azure Migrate. Now, I'll be very clear, Azure Migrate is not limited to rehost approaches. Just for the examples that I'll provide in the next couple of slides, I'll assume that approach. Azure Migrate is a Microsoft-created suite of tools. So it's a first-party tool from a company that knows Azure best. And it's designed to help you assess your workloads and understand the best way to get them on Azure. It's designed to help you with part of that planning stage and with the actual execution of your migration. And it supports migrations of Windows and Linux servers, SQL and non-SQL databases, web apps, VDI infrastructure, data, you name it. If it's a service on Azure, there's probably a tool in Azure Migrate, one of those 16 tools, that'll help you get that workload up to the cloud. The assessment tools support discovery of up to 35,000 servers at once, and you have over 60 global regions to choose to deploy your workloads to. So let's assume that you look at your infrastructure, you look at this Hotel Web 1 server, and you decide, well, Hotel Web 1, Hotel Web 2, and Ubuntu WAF, these are all going to be infrastructure as a service servers. I'm just going to lift and shift them because I need to get them into the cloud as soon as possible. Well, Azure Migrate can help us do that. But as I mentioned, it's not limited to that. So if you have a local SQL Server instance that you want to migrate to Azure SQL, it can absolutely do that as well, for instance. And there's other migration or similar migrations tools to help you migrate to platform as a service. We'll see another example of that in a minute. So using Azure Migrate actually starts with the assessment process. And Azure Migrate can actually leverage several assessment tools. For the most part, it uses the Movera suite of tools. And you may remember Movera as a very, very powerful assessment tool that was available. And you may realize you haven't heard of Movera recently. It's because Microsoft purchased them and they're no longer available for the software is no longer available for just anyone to purchase. But Microsoft leverages it in tools like Azure Migrate to allow you to have very, very deep insights into what you're running right now. And so it's able to show you things like workloads that are 100% ready for Azure, workloads that may be ready for Azure but may need some preparation or mitigation steps. It allows you to see what your monthly storage cost is based on what workloads you want to, what your monthly total cost, storage cost, and other categories of cost are based on what you actually want to migrate to Azure. And what's more, when calculating and when assessing these workloads, of course, you can drill down into any of these. You can see information like the current specs of your servers versus the amount that is actually being used. So you can see that you're only getting 20 or 30% of utilization of your servers. And that allows you to make a lot of decisions when you're actually going to migrate. And it allows you in the cost estimation tool to say, hey, don't mirror these servers as is when generating this estimate, rather do a right sizing exercise and get me the Azure VM size that is closest to what I'm actually using in terms of performance, not what the server has available. You can do things like applying reserved instances, like applying licensing benefits, like Azure Hybrid benefit, and really, really customize the results that this tool gives you to your reality and what you want to migrate. And so it gives you really deep, really accurate insight into what that migration is going to look like. Of course, there are also deployment tools included in Azure Migrate. And those include simple tools like Azure Site Recovery that allows you to take those on-premise workloads that you want to simply lift and shift and completely replicate to the cloud. But it also includes tools to do migrations to platform as a service. We saw one before for an Azure SQL, but you can also migrate, for instance, a web app to an app service plan. And what's more is that all of these tools, both the assessment and the deployment tools, are complemented by third-party tools. So Azure Migrate includes a suite of tools that are Microsoft first, that are completely free, and it also integrates with tools from Carbonite, Cloudomize, Rackware, Lakeside, and much, much more. These may require additional licensing constraints. What other tools are available to help you on your path to the cloud? Well, Microsoft itself is ready to help support your cloud adoption. Microsoft has made available what they call solution assessments. Now, to be very clear, these aren't right for everyone. If you're interested, you have to go through a partner like Inova. We're here to help you. And we have to nominate you to Microsoft. Microsoft has to approve you. It's done on a case-by-case basis. But the solution assessments are essentially those assessments that Azure Migrate can run, plus a couple of additional assessments, run completely by Microsoft. So you forget about installing the tools, running it, analyzing the results. Microsoft does it all for you and hands it to you in a very, very beautiful Power BI dashboard that you can use to select which servers are going to migrate and which aren't, and to perform those cost estimate and exercises to ensure that there is actual ROI in moving. So we looked at two tools that you can leverage. That's Azure Migrate, which you can use for both assessing and deploying your workloads to the cloud. We've looked at Microsoft Solution Assessment, which for some organizations can help simplify that assessment process by having it be run completely by Microsoft resources. But how can Inova Solutions help? Well, I'd like to introduce the Azure Task Force. It's a group that I have the privilege of leading. It's a regional group that is dedicated to helping organizations like yours make the most out of the cloud. It's a group that was created this fiscal year for Inova, so last July. And it's created because we realized that doing cloud right is more than just one project. It's a continuous journey meant to create value for your business. Because let's be honest, the value of the cloud is mostly its agility. Our organizations are living, breathing beings that have needs that change over time. And the value of the cloud is it's very quick to fit itself to those needs. So we want to leverage that value to create organizations that are more scalable, elastic, and resilient. And that's what the Azure Task Force does. But there's a lot of buzzwords there. So what does that mean in plain English? Well, I like to explain it with one example. And it's an example we all probably saw very closely. In March or February of last year, our government said, listen, this virus thing is out of control. You all have to work from home. An organization scrambled to get laptops, and perhaps there wasn't enough inventory at my suppliers, so I had to pay horrifying prices for laptops. And then I had to deploy VPNs and train my users to handle them. And in the rush, maybe I didn't exactly follow best practices. Well, that whole process for Inova was one email. Hey team, we're all staying home and working from there until we say otherwise. Please stay safe. Together we can stop this virus. Send. That's it. Inova never closed a single day, because our employees were already used to working from laptops. They were already used to working from cell phones and personal devices, because Inova was already leveraging the M365 cloud, because Inova was already or had already deployed Azure Information Protection and Azure Active Directory, which allows documents to realize whether they're being opened on a corporate-owned device or a personal device and apply the necessary restrictions, which meant that Inova employees could essentially work from anywhere. So how do we help your business leverage that same flexibility, that same resilience, scalability, and elasticity? Well, we do it through following what Microsoft has published as the Cloud Adoption Framework, which we have adopted and Inovaized as the Azure Task Force Digital Journey. And our entire conversation today has focused essentially on these two strategize and plan steps, and a little bit on this execute step. But you can see there's a lot more to this framework, and it's completely designed to adopt that fail less mindset. And it's one of the things that makes us different. There's a lot of partners doing cloud work, so why trust the ATF? Because we understand that doing cloud right is transformative change. And it's a process that's more about people and businesses and technology. Our organizations are just people working alongside other people to serve people. And digital transformation requires them to change, but people don't like change. The fail less mindset allows us to provide a zero guessing step-by-step path from where you are to where you want to be. And that minimizes the friction of that change and helps strengthen adoption. Another key differentiator is that the Inova Azure Task Force is a regional team. It's all Inova offices. It's Inova Puerto Rico and Jamaica and Ecuador. It's our partners, so it's NetPro and Intech and Solvex. That allows us to say that whether it's data analysis, AI, app modernization, if it's Azure, we can get you there. The Inova Solutions Task Force is meant to help make digital transformation as demystified, as clear, as measurable and predictable as it possibly can be. So if you'd like to learn more about how we can help you, feel free to let us know. Consultations and initial meetings are completely free. In fact, for Inova customers, the initial two stages, that strategize and plan stage that allows us to create this roadmap to the cloud, are completely free with the Azure Task Force. So we're here to help you. Please do leverage us. Please do use us. That's pretty much what I had to share with you today. So Marcy, do we have any questions?
Hey, Nestor. So, no, thank you for your presentation. No, do we have any questions from the public? If no, You can always send Nestor
I'm
an
sorry, Marcy, give
email.
me just one moment. I missed you for a second there. I'm back.
Yeah, you're back? Okay.
Yes.
No, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment, but I would like to thank everyone to join. Um, we would love to hear from you. We would love to know what you thought about our Tech Talk series, what you would like to hear from us. Um, if you have any comments, you can fill out our evaluation form. You can follow the QR code or you can follow the link. I will post it in the chat in the Q&A section. I would also like to invite you to our next Tech Talks session that will be taking place on May 27th. The topic will be Azure Networking and Security Best Practices. It will be at the same time, and you can register using the QR code, or you can follow this link, the link that I posted in the Q&A section. If you do not have any questions at this time, oh, I see a question here. Let me see. Oh, great presentation. Thanks, Nestor. I also thought it was a very great presentation. As always, I learn a lot from you, and I want to thank you for doing this this webinar with us, and I want to thank all attendees for joining.
I'd like to thank everyone as well. It's we realize your time is valuable, so we thank you for spending it with us. I'd like to add, it's very important for us that you do fill out that survey. This session was very theory heavy. It was very mostly talking about the considerations for migration, while our next Tech Talk session is more execution heavy. So it's more about looking at actual environments and actual quick wins that you can apply to increase your security standpoint. So use that survey to tell us more which you would prefer, if you like more of these theory crafting sessions and high level sessions, or if you want more of the execution heavy sessions. Let us know. Use that survey to help us learn what you need, what you would like, and we will personalize our offerings to your needs.
Thank you everyone for joining, and we will see you next time.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.